Picture this. It is November 1326. You are standing in the freezing mud of Hereford, looking up at a spectacle of medieval horror. 50 feet above you, on a scaffold so absurdly high it required special engineers to construct, Hugh Despenser the Younger is being carved apart while still alive. This is not a standard execution, it is a calculated live dissection. The executioner systematically slices off parts of Despenser's body, burning them before his still conscious eyes. This specific mutilation sends a brutal message to the roaring crowd. These are the parts of him that seduced the king and raped the country. Watching this gore from the front row, stone-faced and satisfied, is Isabella of France. She does not flinch. While other queens might have prayed for mercy, Isabella has built a monument to vengeance. How did a 12-year-old girl, married off to secure peace, transform into the only woman in English history to violently depose her husband? Before we dive into this forgotten story of survival and blood, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, please like and subscribe. To understand why a queen would butcher a royal favorite, we must witness the marriage that spawned this hate. Flashback to 1308. Isabella is 12 years old, walking down the aisle of Boulogne Cathedral. She is a vision of French nobility, expecting to become the center of King Edward II's world. She is wrong. Edward does not look at her. His eyes are locked on Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight with a sharp tongue and an even sharper ambition. The humiliation is immediate and excruciating. At their coronation feast, Edward ignores royal protocol entirely. He takes the tapestries bearing Isabella's arms and replaces them with Gaveston's. He takes the jewelry meant for his new bride, her own dowry, and drapes it around Gaveston's neck. He seats the favorite in the place of honor, leaving his child bride in the shadows. This was not just a love affair, it was a political suicide note. For a medieval king, favoritism was the deadliest sin because it upset the hierarchy and threatened the barons. Isabella learned her first lesson in English politics quickly. Survival requires silence. For years, she played the role of the dutiful peaceweaver, bearing Edward 4 children and mediating between him and his furious barons. But the barons lacked her patience. In 1312, they hunted Gaveston down and beheaded him. Isabella likely breathed a sigh of relief, believing the marriage could finally begin. She was wrong. Edward did not mourn Gaveston. He sought a replacement to validate his resentment. He found Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston was a nuisance, Despenser was a predator. He didn't just want the king's affection, he wanted his power. Despenser systematically dismantled the opposition, securing total control over access to the king. No one spoke to Edward without Despenser in the room. Isabella watched as this new favorite grew like a tumor in the heart of the court, recognizing the signs, the diverted funds, the cold shoulder, the total isolation. Despenser was dangerous because he knew that for him to thrive, the queen had to be neutralized. He unleashed a campaign of legalized extortion, breaking the bones of widows to seize their land, while Edward looked away, intoxicated by his favorite's attention. But the true danger for Isabella arrived in 1324, when conflict erupted between England and France. Isabella was the sister of the French king, and Despenser used this to destroy her. He whispered poison into Edward's ear, questioning how he could trust a French woman during a war. Edward declared his own wife an enemy alien, stripping her of her lands and income. Overnight, the queen became a pauper. Her servants were purged, and she was left isolated. Then came the final blow. Despenser ordered her children to be taken away. Her eldest son was handed over to Despenser's own wife to raise. They had orphaned the queen while she was still alive, controlling her money, her husband, and her flesh and blood. Most women would have collapsed, but Isabella was a capet. Backing a mother into a corner doesn't make her docile, it makes her lethal. In 1325, Isabella proposed a diplomatic mission to France to negotiate peace with her brother. Despenser and Edward, desperate to avoid the trip themselves, agreed. It was a fatal miscalculation. They handed the prisoner the key to her cell. Once in France, Isabella refused to return. She declared she would not go back to England as long as Hugh Despenser stood between her and her husband. She famously stated that marriage is a union of two, not three. In the dark underbelly of Paris, she found a weapon, Roger Mortimer, a powerful English lord who had escaped the Tower of London. They were two shipwrecks thrown together by the same storm, and their political alliance quickly turned into a scandalous romance. By sleeping with Mortimer, Isabella burned her bridges. This was high treason. There was no going back. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small mercenary army. They expected a fight, but they found a revolution. The people of England were so tired of Despenser's tyranny that they welcomed the invaders. The king's regime didn't crumble, it evaporated. Edward and Despenser fled to Wales, hunted like animals, while Isabella's forces swept across the country. When they were finally captured, Isabella ensured Despenser's death was a spectacle of biblical cruelty. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body parts sent to the four corners of the kingdom. But the favorite was only the symptom. The king was the disease. Isabella and Mortimer did the unthinkable. They forced Edward II to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, Edward III. The former king was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, but as long as he breathed, he was a threat. On the night of September 21, 1327, screams rang out from Berkeley Castle that could be heard miles away. The official story was that Edward died of natural causes. The dark reality, whispered by chroniclers, was far worse. To leave no mark on the body, his assassins reportedly pinned him down and inserted a red-hot iron poker through a horn into his rectum, burning him from the inside out. It was a horrific, poetic justice in the eyes of his enemies, punishing the part of his body that had supposedly sinned against nature. Isabella and Mortimer were now the unchecked rulers of England, governing in the name of the young Edward III. But they made the same mistake Despenser had. They underestimated the quiet ones. Young Edward III was intelligent, strong, and watching. He saw Mortimer treating him with contempt and parading around like a king. He knew his father's natural death was a lie. In October 1330, the teenage king struck. He led a small band of conspirators through a secret tunnel into Nottingham Castle, emerging in the dead of night outside his mother's chambers. They burst in, finding Isabella and Mortimer together. The queen threw herself at her son's feet, crying out the famous words, "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer." But there was no pity that night. Mortimer was arrested and later hanged at Tyburn, his body left to rot on the gibbet. Isabella was spared execution, but she was stripped of her power and placed under comfortable house arrest. The she-wolf was caged by her own cub. She spent the next 28 years in a gilded prison, a ghost of the woman who had once commanded armies. Isabella died in 1358. Her final request remains one of the most chilling details in medieval history. She asked to be buried in her wedding dress, the same silk gown she had worn 50 years earlier as a 12-year-old girl, walking down the aisle to marry the man she would eventually destroy. But there was one more thing. She requested to be buried with a small casket placed on her breast. Inside that casket was the embalmed heart of King Edward II. Think about the psychological weight of that image. Here lies a woman who waged war on her husband, humiliated him, and sanctioned his horrific murder. Yet, in death, she chose to clutch his heart to her chest for eternity. Was it an act of profound remorse? Was she trying to rewrite history, casting herself as the loyal wife one last time? Or was it the ultimate act of possession, a final signal that even in death, she owned him? For centuries, historians painted Isabella as a villain, a caricature of female wickedness. They called her the she-wolf of France. But look closer, and the monster fades. Isabella was a survivor. She was a child bride ignored for favorites, a mother whose children were stolen, a queen declared an enemy in her own land. In a world where women were expected to be silent pawns, Isabella flipped the board. She refused to be a victim. If she became a wolf, it was only because the sheep were being slaughtered. Her legacy is not just the blood she spilled, but the king she created. Her son, Edward III, would become one of England's greatest monarchs. So when you think of Isabella, don't just see the red-hot poker or the 50-foot gallows. See the girl who stood alone at a feast, watching her husband give her jewels to another man, and decided she would not be erased. She was the she-wolf, and she bit back.